Every great creative work stands on the shoulders of giants. Welcome to RetroInspection, where we examine and find out where the things we love today came from.
So, Nick, what are we going to talk about today in light of the current season we are in, which is the Halloween season?
Today we're going to be talking about Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
So, Robert Louis Stevenson, very famous writer, made his name in the late 1800s, very popular during that time after the publication, I think, of Treasure Island. He became this world traveler, and he wrote several other novels aside from Treasure Island, including the novella that we're going to talk about today, Dr. Jekyll, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But he was primarily known as a travel writer during his day, but we really remember him as a novelist. And I found him first as a kid when I read Treasure Island. And I remember I remember loving this book. It was chock full of pirate adventure in I think it was in the Pacific. I'm pretty sure it was. Well, anyways, it was,
if memory serves,
across the world. Yeah, across the world, following this pirate adventure, and essentially it was a novel that we would talk about today in terms of young adult fiction, and that's how I found it. But it was just a fantastic book, as I recall. I haven't read it in.
I'm not certain.
I don't want to say how many years.
Well, I had a condensed for kids version when I was in elementary school. It wasn't like a picture book or anything, but you could, they had chopped. And if there had been anything that was even objectionable, that got out. Like I had an anthology of crime stories for kids that did that to Silver Blaze that removed some of the details that might be considered gruesome. So.
Well, I think I found this in my elementary school library, and there were a whole host of novels that I just went through. I happened to actually work in a library, so I was able to pick and choose all of these different classics. I can't remember how many biographies I read, but Treasure Island was one of my favorites. But Robert Louis Stevenson, he was a writer, and he kind of fell into this, vocation and really the love of this art because he was a sickly child. I think he was the only child to a lighthouse designer, who was also, he and his wife were diehard, I don't know, diehard is not the right word, but devout Presbyterian.
Yeah, Calvinist.
Scottish, very, I guess later in life, quite a pro-independent Scot, as I recall. But Robert Louis Stevenson suffered from a lifelong cough, lifelong illness that affected his breathing. So he needed to get out of Scotland. I guess the damp air, the cold air really affected him. So he tried to move to warmer environments, which eventually led him to America, where he essentially crossed the United States. And I'm not sure where he actually might have met his wife, Fanny, in France. And she was an expatriate American who was essentially trying to avoid her husband at the time. and she was
Wikipedia
much older
says
than
England. She was 34, had a kid, but they were separated from the son.
Yeah. And her husband was a philanderer, and she sought divorce, and eventually they ended up together in San Francisco, or the San Francisco area. And there are many, many parks and historical places, features up in Northern California that bear his name. In fact, if you ever travel across the Bay Bridge, if you have enough money to pay the toll, you will cross over Treasure Island. Now, I don't know if Robert Louis Stevenson ever set foot on that island, but it was a naval base for many, 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 many years. And one of my good friends, I actually had to go and pick him up there at one point because he was working on the film Flubber in the abandoned naval base there. It wasn't abandoned, but it was leased out to various other entities, and right. And but I think it's still there intact. At any rate, Treasure Island is named that way because of Robert Louis Stevenson and the travels he did across California, Northern California, and America. But I think he eventually ended up in the Pacific, I think in Samoa. And he ended his life there, I think. But the environment suited him best because he was, throughout his life, very sick. And apparently he wrote Dr. Jekyll, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde while he was in England. But this Dr. Jekyll and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was not at all in the vein of writing that Robert Louis Stevenson had done up until that point. He was very much an adventure writer.
Yeah.
And then he ended up writing this novel, which is some critics believe it is the pinnacle of Gothic literature. And Gothic literature, depending on which critic you're going to follow, may have started with Dante's Inferno or much later with the English novelists. But essentially, Gothic literature is concerns supernatural events, but is highly peppered with the fears of the characters, and it's very much about fear. And so when we talk about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we're really talking about some fears within the society of certain emerging things.
Like, subscribe, repost, share everywhere. To see what else we're up to, visit xynobooks.com, xenobooks.com.